Hey everybody, on a lot of these videos, we like to talk about things from like a pretty inside baseball kind of perspective. And something that comes up a lot is that like we have people that are pretty new to YouTube and are trying to figure out how to do things when they're just getting started. And we kind of don't do enough for those people. So I'm pretty excited about this, but today we are going to talk about how to do thumbnails for complete beginners. So if you're wanting to get started on YouTube and you're unsure about thumbnails and you're nervous about what to do, this is the place for you. Let's get into it. So you'll often hear us talk about thumbnails as being one of the most important things on YouTube, and that is generally true. When we're talking about thumbnails, we're talking about the first time that you get to really interact with your audience. When they see your video, that's the first thing they're gonna see about it. It's the first thing that determines whether or not an audience member clicks on your video. So when I scroll through YouTube, my eyes are naturally going to drift to thumbnails as the first thing that's going to make the decision about what I click on. And then from there, I might read the title and see what the video is about from there. But that thumbnail is really the first thing that's going to pull my attention in that direction. If I don't pull their attention initially, I'll never convince you to click on it. You'll never get a view. It doesn't matter how great your video is if you can't convince somebody else that it's great. So for this reason, we really value thumbnails. This is really firing from the hip, but if I had to talk about by percentage the importance of different things on YouTube, about 40% would be like programming and content, 40% would be thumbnails, 10% would be titles, and the remaining 10% would be like everything else. Thumbnails are super important. They're basically as important as the content you actually put into the video. Broadly speaking, there's about 4 things that I want a thumbnail to be. The first is eye-catching. When I look at a thumbnail, I want it to pull my eyes naturally. So if I want to think about eye-catching, what I like to do is pull up the YouTube homepage and then look away for a bit, and then look back. What is your eyes drawn to immediately? So let's scroll down. We'll scroll randomly here. I'm not looking. I'm gonna look. What am I drawn to? Okay, toxic waste. That symbol naturally draws me. There's this guy, the emotive face down here. That's a little bit, pulling me in. That's what we mean by eye-catching. Something that naturally draws your eye in that split second. When we're talking about eye-catching, we're not so much speaking to your sensibilities from like a content consideration, we're speaking to the idea of like that lizard brain, that evolutionary thing in you. And that's why you hear a lot about like different faces, because when we talk about like an angry face, or a surprised face, or a happy face, that's something that your brain would have evolved naturally to really focus in on as a social creature, right? Like if the person across the way is really angry or really sad or really happy, it's really important for you to know that in the moment. And so your eyes kind of snap to it. That's why you hear about eye contact a lot too. That's why you'll hear about bright colors. We'll get more into kind of the nitty gritty of things that you should be looking to do when it comes to thumbnails a little bit later. But for now, suffice it to say that the goal is to try and draw the eye naturally and super quick. Just bam, right there. Right there. That's what I want this to look. That's what you're trying to get. That's the main goal. If you can do just that one thing and you can do it consistently, you are so far ahead of the game. Secondly, the thumbnail needs to be representative. You'll hear people talk about clickbait and you'll hear all sorts of things about deceptive thumbnails, and it's something that does happen from time to time, but you really don't want to do that even if you would be really good and you have a really good idea for a thumbnail. Let's say 10 times the glass was not strong enough. Oh man, there's a shark and it's coming to get this poor kid. Oh snap. Let's say I go into this and I'm gonna start watching the video. I'm going to be, as a viewer, wondering if this video is going to deliver on its promise. It might not be the shark exactly, but is it even getting close? And if it's not, I'm going to click away. And oh, there's a picture, that's kind of exciting. Where's the shark? When's the shark happen? When's the shark happen, dog? Not seeing a whole lot of shark. Oh, there's some water. Do we get a shark? Ooh, there's some spooky glass. If you don't deliver on your promise, eventually, like now, I'm going to click away. And YouTube's going to note that I didn't watch that video for very long. And if I don't watch that video for very long, they're going to start to kind of think that maybe I didn't enjoy it. And if lots of people click away really quick, you won't get a lot of watch time, and YouTube will start to assume that you really didn't satisfy your viewers. So as much as possible, our video needs to represent our content accurately. It can be a little bit sensational, it can be a little bit over the top, but we can't lie to our viewers. Third, in addition to being interesting, it should also complement the title really well. Ideally, we'll get into titles at a later date, but let's go into one of my favorite title thumbnail combinations right now. This is not yellow. This is my favorite combination ever. Where did it go? What the hell? Okay, well, up until very recently, my favorite thumbnail was for this Vsauce video, which was just a yellow screen saying, "This is not yellow," which is really exciting. I have to assume that this is a test of some kind, because what? if we could edit in a yellow screen, because that's what it normally is, and that's such a compelling combination, which is kind of more of an exception to the rule, but it hits on the idea that like title and thumbnails should be kind of married together. And the last broad philosophical point on thumbnails is that thumbnails are ideally really good at small sizes. And this is something that trips up a lot of people that are making thumbnails for the first time, is when you go into Photoshop or any other image editor and you're putting together a photo, it's really easy to make a really cool, really good looking thumbnail. And a lot of people forget that they're not seeing it at that size. They're seeing it at a very small fraction of that. And I can kind of illustrate that point. So here is a very iconic photo that I have pulled up. It looks very good. You've probably seen this before. It stood the test of time. Look what happens to this image when we zoom out a little bit. It's still a good image. This is it at like thumbnail size, right? It's a lot harder to tell what's going on because against like the background, which if you're running YouTube in night mode, this is gonna be roughly the color. It's hard to see what's going on. It's hard to see the kiss just with the way it's silhouetted. It's a little bit weird. Now this photo in particular is so iconic that you might be able to put it together even at this small size, but you'll notice that it doesn't really draw your eye in the same way. You don't get as much of the emotion or expression of the embrace or the kiss. Now let's go over to this other image, which I have already zoomed out, and see how much more this draws your eye. Nicolas Cage's face is just right there. He's got those bugged out eyes. It immediately pulls your focus in. It's also a fairly iconic image, but you get the idea. You are naturally drawn to that big emotive expression because there's an instinctual part of you that needs to know if Nicolas Cage is a threat. And to be fair, especially with Nicolas Cage and his faces, that's probably a good thing that your brain can do that. So those are two images that weren't designed to be thumbnails, and you can see how they're different. So now let's take a look at a thumbnail designed for YouTube with YouTubers React. And you can see that, man, they have taken really expressive faces. It maximizes that idea. They've used bright colors and high contrast to pop it out of the page, and also these really emotive faces that really pull you in. This stands out really, really well, especially when compared to something like this or this. If you have an image that's eye-catching and interesting and representative, but it's only those things when it's at a really big size, it doesn't matter. You can have a really cool thumbnail with a really cool image that's married with a really cool title, and it's not going to matter if it doesn't show up at the size it would on a mobile phone. So anytime you're making a thumbnail, depending on if you're doing on a Mac or PC, it's like Command minus or Control minus to zoom out. Take your picture, zoom it way far back. Those are the kinds of sizes you're designing for, and you need to keep that in mind. So what are some good practices for designing a good thumbnail? First off, let's get through the exact particulars. A thumbnail should usually be a PNG and should be 1280 by 720 pixels. If you are not specifically a graphic designer, but you have some kind of graphic designing software, your default settings are probably fine file size as long as you're exporting a PNG 1280 by 720. You can use a JPEG 1280 by 720. Usually there are some weird artifacting issues. We're talking about small enough images that it usually doesn't come up, but that's getting kind of inside baseball again. Good place to start, 1280 by 720 PNG. When it comes to what to put in your thumbnail, one of the first places that we start looking is facial expressions. Facial expressions, again, are something that naturally draw you in, and they also give you an immediate sense of what kind of the emotion and feel of a video is. If I'm really contemplative, or I'm really angry, or I'm really happy, that can tell you something about the video that you're about to watch. And yes, it might be a little bit exaggerated. Even in the videos, if I talk about being frustrated, I'm usually not going, "Argh." But it serves as kind of a visual shorthand. When you're trying to get pictures, it's usually a good idea to actually take some still images, or at like the end of a recording to pause and just like hold on facial expressions, because in motion it can be hard to get something. Like if you just pause videos in the middle, it's really hard to get exactly a frame. But if you like pause at the end of a video and you just sit there for a few seconds and go, you can start to get the idea. If you're a total beginner and you don't have a ton of equipment, then you should try and set up a really interesting background that you can photograph yourself against and then use that as an image. That's not the best way to do it. Ideally, if you have some photo editing software or you have a little bit of cash, you can either use something like Photoshop to cut yourself out of the background, or you can go to something like remove.bg, which is a service that will like isolate faces out so that you can have just like you without any background, and then you can put it against whatever you want. But ultimately, one of the best things you can do is have really expressive faces. That's a very good shorthand, a very good way to get started on a thumbnail immediately. And you can kind of see that if we go to our thumbnails here, right? Like we have these different thumbnails. And actually, I owe Matt some more facial expressions. We had some tech stuff come up, and I know that he's expecting it this time. And I am sorry, Matt. But you can see here kind of the idea. We have slightly emotional me. We actually have the background, although it's a slightly different angle, I think, than we typically take, which makes me think that we did cut this image out and then slid it over a little bit. But if you can't do that, getting a nice close-up image on like a pretty cool background, and this is a pretty cool background, that's gonna get you a lot of the way there. It'll also give you good practice on looking at the camera, which is something that I have struggled with, and people have called me out on, and it's fair, I get it. Usually then you're going to take that face to the left or the right. As a side note, if you're not on camera but you use something else with facial expressions, like if you're talking about a video game character, you can do kind of the same thing. It works under the same principles. You're trying to capture that highly emotive expression. Or sometimes you might not have something that's an obvious primary element, like a face or a character, though frequently that happens. So let's look at UFO sightings, because here's where you get another way to do primary elements. Because UFO footage, as you might be shocked to know, is usually not very high quality, but if you want to talk about UFO sightings, you have to get around that. Enter the magic arrow and the magic circle. This is something when you have really crummy footage, and it doesn't have to just be UFO conspiracy stuff. You will use really, really bright circles and really, really bright arrows to try and pull your eyes in. This does the same eye-catching thing as like a normal primary element by just using a really, really bright color. And then it sort of forces you to ask, what's going on in that picture when I look close? And then that sort of kind of inspires you to look at the title. Like if you can't tell, like, what am I looking here? What are these dots? Astronauts report possible UFO sighting. Huh, what do you know? I mean, it's not something that I'm actually going to look up. I don't like UFO sighting stuff. I'm not even going to give them the click. But it's a really interesting thing. You can see this also with something like movie mistakes. They have faces in them too. So we have like this hilarious thing right here. We also have here the bright yellow arrow. And that brings us kind of neatly into our next best practice, which is bright colors. So if you look right now, I use YouTube in night mode. There's also this super bright white mode, which kind of hurts my eyes as far as I'm concerned. Either of these are a valid way to view YouTube, more power to you. But we want bright, high saturation colors that stand out from either of those, because when I'm just browsing through, having something with really bright sudden colors really helps pull your eye. Like, oh man, these are really, really bright. This is really, really bright. That really, really helps pull your eye. Now, obviously, a lot of people are doing it, and so it can be hard to stand out in kind of the space. You still want a good image. You can't just rely on having a red arrow, because that's super easy to repeat. But it's really, really helpful to stand out against the background and to really pop against it if you're using bright colors. A lot of people default to yellow because of the idea that you have different cones in your eyes that detect different colors, and yellow is a color that requires highly activating two of your cones, and therefore it is neurologically like the most stimulating color. Whether or not that leads to higher click-through is sort of up for debate. Matt's very pro it. I am at least scientifically skeptical, but it is a good, compelling color, and I still like the use of yellow. Along those lines, you also want high contrast, which gets back to the idea of the sailor picture, right? Like, part of the problem here is that there's low contrast, so the elements start to blend together. If you look the same color as your background, you'll start to blend into it. So you need elements to really stand out, which is part of the reason that I talked about like remove.bg or using Photoshop to isolate yourself, because then you can manipulate the background and yourself differently so that you can make yourself really pop, and you can have those representative elements really, really, really stand out. So if you have one really compelling face and you have really bright colors, you might be asking what we do with the rest of the thumbnail, and a lot of people start to use text, including us, which if you go to our channel, you can see that we use text in thumbnails. And text is certainly fine. It can certainly add an interesting thing. It can be really compelling, but we need to remember that these need to look really good at small size, which means that the text needs to be really big. And also, we want compelling images, and the more time we spend on text, the less time we're spending on a compelling image. So we really, really want to limit text, and we want it to be really, really readable. For this, we don't like to do more than a few words, maybe like a full sentence. So something like, start a YouTube channel in 2021. Best video length? Do these if you want views. Text is something that should complement the thumbnail. Usually it's something that's gonna be a little bit teasy. It's gonna leave a little bit of an information gap to hopefully be just that little bit more exciting. You'll also see that this is where we make use of bright saturated colors. This is where we use our yellows and reds. This is where we get those little splashes of just popping the video out from the background. But again, you don't wanna overdo it. You don't want the thumbnail to be a paragraph that people have to read. And if you're in the kid space, this goes doubly. If your audience is broadly illiterate, don't give them text to read. If you have a kids channel, no text. If they're starting to get into like 8 to 10, you can, but it's still not like super compelling. as much as possible, avoid text until you're getting into like 10 plus would be kind of my broad rule of thumb. So if you're doing that, that should give you a pretty good broad base for what to do for a thumbnail. Have some interesting primary element, something that your audience will draw its attention to immediately, usually a face, but it doesn't have to be, and have that be the primary focus and put that kind of on the left or the right. Ideally, it's something that should really stand out from the background. If it's a face, it should be really, really emotive. If you can choose colors, ideally we want high saturation, we want them to be very bright, and we want them to stand out from YouTube's kind of base backgrounds. If you're going to use text, keep it to a minimum, make sure that it's very legible, even at a small size. One more thing to keep in mind is never put anything in the bottom right corner of a video. If you look in the bottom right of every video, you'll see a video length indicator, and sometimes it'll actually be like a little watch later now thing. Usually it's how long the video is. It's really, really, really important that you don't put anything that you want your audience to see there, because at different sizes, it will get totally blocked, and you really, really don't want that. It's a small thing, but it's something that comes up all the time when you're new at thumbnails, and it's not world ending, but it's something that it's good to keep in mind. That is, broadly speaking, kind of the best practices for thumbnails. Something else I'd like to make note of at this point is that a lot of people will use Photoshop because Photoshop is one of the best image editing tools out there. But if you're really, really new at this and you're not sure what you're doing and you don't want to invest in Photoshop, something that you can actually try out doing is using PowerPoint or Keynote if you're on a Mac. And if you can do something like remove.bg, you can put a bunch of images on a slide and move them around and get kind of okay results as an image editor. It's never going to be as powerful, it's never going to be as flexible, but if you're just doing really simple things and you're putting your one primary element and maybe some high contrast text on a thumbnail, it will do everything that you need it to do. Having graphic design software helps, but it's more important to have good graphic design principles than it is to have good graphic design software. And the very last thing we want to touch on is, how do you know if a thumbnail's worked? We've talked about this a lot, but the main way to tell if a thumbnail was effective is to look at CTR. CTR is a function of how often people clicked on a thumbnail when they were shown that thumbnail. Obviously, the title can also play a part in this, but largely speaking, it's a thumbnail. We're pretty visual creatures. So if I want to see how this thumbnail did, I'm going to come over on the analytics page to Reach. Reach is going to show me the impressions click-through rate, which started on day 1 at 4.1%. It's actually a little bit low kind of from what I'm prospecting, and it certainly dropped down from that. It's part of the reason that we want to make sure that I take expressive pictures after this, which didn't happen that time. That's on me. As I say in the video, I was moving at the time and very distracted. I have a bet again, and I gotta tell you, having a bet is great. So we come over to Reach, we come over to CTR. What does this mean? Is 3.3 good? I mean, no, it's not. But how do I tell if it's good? And usually this is something that, frustratingly enough, is going to be relative to you. And in the case of like when we're doing our videos, it's relevant to me versus when Matt does a video, because the audience has slightly different expectations and preferences, and that's totally natural. But there are a couple of numbers that we want to look at specifically. First off is kind of the overall CTR as it exists overall, in this case, 3.3%. Something I'm very keen on is what was my CTR on day 1, because on day 1, that's when my most loyal, most core audience is there. If I have a high day 1 CTR, that means that a lot of my core fans really, really liked it and clicked on it frequently. And that means that YouTube's gonna go, wow, a lot of people clicked on this, so we can send this to a wider audience. And then if it does really well in that wider audience, it's going to go to a wider and wider audience until YouTube has kind of thought, we've reached the maximum size of people interested in this. Day 1 CTR is really, really important. If you ever have a video that does particularly well with a day 1 CTR, you really, really wanna try and emphasize that. And if you have one that has a really bad day 1 CTR, you really wanna try avoiding whatever you did in that thumbnail. The rest of the days matter too, obviously. This gets into kind of a wider, broader audience, and it tends to be dependent on how good your day 1 CTR is. So it's a little bit less telling as a metric, because over time they'll kind of all normalize to the same point. If I'm doing some kind of consulting contract, I'm going to get way deeper into this, but that's where I would look if you're just starting out and just complete beginner. Make the best thumbnail you can, look at what it does on day 1, and try and get the highest day 1 CTR you can. The rest will probably follow after that. With that, you should basically have enough information that you can start making thumbnails for your channel, even if you're a complete beginner. So with that, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, check out these other videos we have on audience development. If you like this video, be sure to leave a like to let us know that you liked it. And especially, we'd like to know if you want to see more of these kind of complete beginner style videos. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Little Monster for more videos like this every single week. See you next time.